Okay, I think everybody's found a seat, so welcome to this next panel where we're going to be focusing on responsible innovation and really taking a deeper dive into this topic and thinking about it in practical terms as well. So to introduce myself, I'm Steve Wood. I'm Director of PrivacyX Consulting, an independent firm. I'm also a Special Advisor to the law firm, A&O Sherman, and I'm also a visiting Policy Fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute here. And in a previous life as well, I have a background in regulation, so I used to be the Deputy Information Commissioner at the ICO, the UK's data protection regulator. And we've got a great panel for you today, a really strong mix of different perspectives and experience. So we've got someone who's working in big tech, we've got someone who's just left big tech, and we've got a think tank perspective, and we've got a civil society perspective. So I think really important actually for this sort of topic on responsible approaches to generative AI, but we've got that multidisciplinary approach. And in the panel today, I want to explore a little bit as well to make sure we've got a common understanding of what the term responsibility for generative AI means and how we can think about that in practice. I want to think about who sets those norms and how they're shaped. Also, how does the concept of responsibility fit alongside legal and regulatory obligations? Because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. And how does this actually sort of practically fit with governance? And how can it actually be demonstrated in real and practical terms as well? So lots of interesting questions. And of course, I think looking at this in a global context. So we'll explore what it means at a global level, but also looking at and seeing whether there are any differences emerging in jurisdictions around the world where conversations are taking place about responsibility. And I think the one thing we hear is a lot of companies will use the term responsible development of AI or responsible deployment. Clearly, companies don't just say they're irresponsible. So the term is used a lot, and we're really going to take that deeper dive and drill into it in the panel. I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves when they start their first intervention and explain a little bit about their work when they do that as well. So to kick us off, I just actually do want to ask the question, well, how do we actually really define the term responsibility for generative AI development? What does it mean in terms of the concept of responsible innovation? And how do we actually really translate that from principles into practice as well? So what does it actually mean in concrete terms for organizations who are developing and deploying generative AI? So I'm going to turn to Edward first, and I'll hand you the mic.
Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Edward Tsoi. I'm the co-founder of AI Safety Asia. So we are a nonprofit focusing on AI safety, particularly in Southeast Asia. So I've spent the past few years in technology startup, as well as running my own charity in Myanmar, focusing on countering disinformation since 2011. I also serve on the board of Amnesty International Hong Kong previously. So I've done a bit of everything. And when I look at the questions of responsible AI, I think the first few questions that I'll be asking is, whose responsibility? What kind of responsibility? Responsibility to whom? And how are we enforcing those responsibility? I'm not going to dive into the exact definition or responsibility of AI, but a few things that I will also bring up is that a quick short story about my Myanmar charity. I mean, we have been running counter disinformation campaign since 2011, and we mainly work with high school students and uni students in Myanmar. One thing that struck my mind was a 11 to 12-year-old kid in Myanmar saying that I want to kill Buddha, I want to kill Muslim, because of things that they've read on Facebook. So these are the very downstream implications of some of these technology that was developed very far from the actual reality. So one thing that I also wish we can discuss in this panel is the social technical aspect of the technology.
Okay.
There's hallucination.
Yeah. Okay, I'm Juliana. I work at Google. I'm representing big tech here. So I lead Google's global AI campaign. And as you can notice from my British accent, I come from Brazil, but I've been in London for 4 years now. And I think For the past years, I've been working a lot with Google's approach to responsibility, and I think one of the key things that we believe is that we need to be bold and responsible from the start. And we know that both dimensions of responsibility, they sometimes collide to each other, they have friction, and we think that that friction is important for us to embrace. So the way we see that in the company is that responsibility has these two dimensions. So we need to be bold and we need to seize the opportunities. We truly believe in the transformative power of AI and Gen AI, that it can change societies, it can help people to access to knowledge, they can enhance health solutions throughout the world, but it also comes with risks. It's not everything that's working in perfect way around the world. So therefore, Google was one of the first companies to develop principles. So our responsible approach to AI is guided by, can you hear me? I think, okay. Because we had an echo and now we don't have that anymore. So it's guided by our principles. So we have 7 principles that tell us how to work with AI. And those principles, they are applied from the beginning of an application. So we have a central team that evaluates new applications and new systems that we are about to develop, and they test those proposals with the principles. So I have these principles here, and they are all public if you want to check. So for example, one of the principles, it is to be socially beneficial. So we need to test our ideas if they will bring more opportunities and more benefits to society than risks. And I think one of the concrete examples, and I think it relates to what Steve mentioned, no one's going to say they are irresponsible, but what responsibility means in a concrete manner. Google made a decision a few years ago not to launch commercially one application that was the application of generative AI tools to facial recognition, because we understood that it would bring more risks than benefits to society, so the decision was not to launch that. The other principle that we have here is to uphold high standards of scientific excellence. And one of our applications in the past, I don't know if for those who have Pixel phones, we have this application called Portrait Light that helps us to enhance artificial light in pictures. When you're taking a selfie, you need to adjust light. And we understood when we were developing, so it wasn't in the beginning of the application, but it was in the testings of this application that some of those tools that were being developed in the Portrait Light application, they could enhance bias on skin color. So we had to adjust, and we used AI to adjust that application, and we published a paper that's also available online, so other researchers and other companies wouldn't have to go through all the process that we had to avoid bias. So I think those are just 2 examples that I would like to mention to make sure that we are being really concrete and responsible from the beginning. And the second part is that we have what we call an AI responsible life cycle. So it's not only in the initial phases of development, so the design of the product, the research involved in the design, on the development of this product, but also after we deploy the product and based on user feedback, we need to test and we need to adjust. So this Google's AI research lifecycle process is also available publicly. You can check that 4 phases of the cycle. It's really detailed, the paper we launched, and I think it connects to our commitment to transparency. And the last point I would like to bring, I think it relates to what Edward brought, that responsible to who and who is enforcing. And I think that one of the key dimensions of responsibility, besides being bold, besides being responsible from the beginning, is together. So we truly believe that AI is an nascent technology. There's so much to learn about that. So we need to partner not only with researchers, with other industry partners, but also governments to understand what responsible means to whom. And it will differ depending on countries and etc. So we partner with different industry, for example, industry partners, for example, to launch the Frontier Model Forum, the Partnership for AI. So I think there are lots of initiatives across industry with researchers trying to understand what responsible means, how we can be more responsible, and also with government. So we were a really active partner with governments during the Hiroshima process that led to the G7 Code of Practice for Responsible AI. We engaged in lots of discussions with the UN, with the OECD. So I think at the end, what's important, we are still understanding as a society what responsible means, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be responsible from the beginning. And I don't think that one company will sort it out by itself what responsible means. We have our principles, we have our transparency practices, but it takes together lots of think tanks, researchers, and other partners so we can get it right.
Okay, my name is Renato Monteiro. As seen here, I'm a policy fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. I'm also part of the Brazilian crew at this event, and I heard it's getting bigger by the year, so everybody is always welcomed over here. I used to be a part of the group that belongs to Big Tech. I'm not anymore. For the last 5 years, I worked at Twitter, first Twitter, then X. I was the global head of privacy, and over the last 2 years, I also support and led some AI initiatives, the governance initiatives at the company over here. And I guess getting a little bit of what Jules, we know for many, many years. So what Jules said over here in a nutshell when he said about responsible AI, the way I see I'm a human rights, fundamental rights lawyer by formation. And what I believe to be on responsible AI is the ideation, development, and deployment of AI that embodies all the best ethical values that you can have in humanity. And if we get on the keynote speaker that we had in this morning, that says AI can only be trusted if you embody the best ethical values of humanity. And I do believe in that, in the way that you're deploying all of that. So in a way that we ensure that AI technology serves humanity while minimizing harm. I guess we discussed, we have been seeing, and I guess we're going to be seeing over these last 2 days a lot of discussions of what can be catastrophic harms, but I guess we need also to focus while developing how these generative AI tools and projects and services, they have impact on the most fundamental rights, not only, for example, privacy, which is my area of expertise, but also the other fundamental rights, human rights that are enshrined in international treaties and organizations that we have the chance to participate.
Hi everyone. So my name is Ayesha Bhatti. I work for the Center for Data Innovation. For those of you who don't know, we're a pro-innovation think tank. So we advocate for pro-innovation policies that promote technology. And my role specifically covers UK and EU AI policy. So firstly, totally concur, I think, with what has already been said. Responsible AI is such a loaded phrase, and it's funny because we use it every day, and I think everyone has an idea of what it means, but we don't necessarily agree on the exact definition. From my perspective, I think responsible AI is really about having AI systems that benefit us rather than harm us. And that really speaks to the way that it's used as opposed to the technology itself. I don't believe that AI is inherently good or bad. It's really about how we use it. And the question of who is responsible, I think that's such a great question to ask. And to try and answer it, I think we all have a role to play in that responsibility. It's not just industry, civil society, government, but it's also the users as well and the general public. And it kind of goes back to the idea of when we do engage with everyone, we also remember the people that are interacting with the technology, which is the general public. And to sort of touch upon the topic of the panel around safety and innovation, I think that dichotomy is also really interesting because it's typically spoken about as two opposing ideas. You can either have safety or you can have innovation. But the way that I see it, and particularly for AI, I think that safety is just one subset of innovation. And what that means practically is that when we do innovate and we do try and advance these really powerful models, we also throw weight, resources, expertise into the safety mechanisms that can support that. as well as the evaluations and the techniques that are used to understand a model's capabilities. And I think that's why the work, for example, of the AI Safety Institute is so powerful, because they are doing a lot of that work, and I do consider that work to be really innovative, even though it's all directed at safety.
Okay. Yeah. Quick point.
Yeah, regarding last point on that safety innovation dichotomy, I think that reminds me of something that one of our advisors, Professor Robert Traeger from the Martin School, was saying. Essentially, that might be the wrong framing. I mean, given the dual-use nature of this technology, you have to guarantee safety by design, by the nature of it. Otherwise, it's going to be a potentially dangerous technology, and the potential path of going with that technology might be something similar to the non-proliferation of nuclear technology, which is not to the beneficial of everyone. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to be harnessed, no matter for people in the global north or global south. And the other thing that I'll quickly add is I have seen some very promising progress from the industry as well. I mean, for example, I think DeepMind has issued some framework around socio-technical assessment. So how do you look at the model at the capability level and then to human interaction level? And then next, which is very important, and also the theme of this summit, is the societal level. And the technology's implication will manifest differently in London to Jakarta to Yangon. How do we truly able to capture the potential implications across the entire world for different kinds of population will be very important.
So just a quick comment here. And I totally agree when normally we see safety versus innovation, where I could never see them as an opposing concepts. And I guess from experience, I was deeply involved in the development of a number of AI services and technology and solutions over the last years. And when we implemented some internal processes, we're going to talk about governance, but that came from either privacy by design, or you can call it safety by design, where you kind of a mandate that in each step of the development, you have to assess which type of risks. You can do it and push for innovation. So when you get engineers and you get all the multidisciplinary teams to understand how the technology works, what are the cases, what are the solutions they are trying to address, they can come up with new ideas, with new solutions, with new situations, with new problems. So I don't see this as a disparity. I see this as two sides of the same coin.
Okay, well, thanks so much, the panel, for already sort of kicking us off, I think, in a great interactive discussion. And I think it's been really interesting to sort of hear the points about accountability, so about thinking about who you're accountable to, and that's going to be probably a complicated map of many different types of stakeholders and legal bodies and regulators, et cetera, in that mix. I think it's really important that that's mapped out. I think we've heard lots of really good messages about understanding how the concept of responsibility is actually embedded by design. So I think that's come through from the panelists. I think that's an important reminder of how you've actually got to really walk the talk and how they can't just be principles on paper. And I think this idea as well about how you actually get the concepts of safety and innovation really working together. And obviously you can only do that through that real practical design-led implementation. So I think we've got off to a great start, and hopefully some questions and ideas forming with you out in the audience as well. And lastly as well, that point about the sort of the socio-technical concept of how you actually really understand the way that these generative AI systems are developed and how they're actually working with humans, I think, is an incredibly important topic, and we're going to come back to that later in the panel as well. What I want to do next is just sort of move a little bit further into the topic and think about it as a global versus sort of regional topic. So I think this is important as well because some of the major technology companies are obviously centered in a certain part of the world, and that's where a lot of the innovation is being driven from. But obviously, these technologies are being deployed and used all around the world. So what I want to ask the panel is really, to what extent can we sort of shape global norms for responsibility related to generative AI? Or what differences may we see when we're considering some of these questions that are at a regional level or at a national level? And again, we've got a good range of experience on the panel to unpick some of these questions. So, Edward, again, back to you to talk about Asia in particular and what you see compatible at a global level.
Yeah, sure. The first point that I will touch on is the current level of consultation. So we have been having quite a lot of interesting conversation with our partner organization who was preparing for the Future of Summit event just happened not too long ago at the United Nations. And one very interesting quick audit that they did at one of the working group is that currently 2/3 of the world countries are not involved in any sort of formal consultation in terms of AI governance. 2/3 of the countries in the world right now. The other interesting conversation that I had was with another former public policy employee from Meta. He was doing an audit at the delegates to the UK AI Summit. And from his calculation, I mean, he came up with 9% of the delegates are actually from the Global South. So that's a very shocking number. And this is right now a very important point of time because right now we are seeing a convergence of different initiative and governance effort converging maybe at the AI Safety Institute level. So you have the global conference happening in November among all the global AI Safety Institutes around the world. So this is a very important moment to be able to ensure representative presence of all the stakeholders involved. I mean, Sir Nigel from this morning, he was saying something that I resonate a lot. I mean, if a decision involves a lot of people, then that decision should probably involve a lot of people. So the other points that I will point out is the starting point of that conversation is also very different. I mean, our focus is Southeast Asia. So for example, fundamentally, I mean, if you want to talk about AI adoption, no matter for training or deployment, you have to look at some very basic infrastructure like electricity. So for context, Singapore, which is the only developed country in Southeast Asia within the ASEAN context, they have about 9,000 kilowatt per hour per person per year. So that's kind of the level of Singapore. For a modern nation state, usually you will be requiring about 6,000 kilowatt per hour per person per year. And if you look at countries like Indonesia, they are at around 1,000 kilowatt per hour per person per year, which is a big gap even between Indonesia and Singapore. And we had the former Minister of Trade, Pakita, joining one of our conversations last month to talk about AI safety in the context of Indonesia. And his calculation is essentially for Indonesia to catch up from the current level to 6,000 kilowatt per hour, that will require them 100 years to catch up, just on the electricity consumption level. And the other thing that I will look at is this kind of technology will impact countries in very different way. So for example, one of the countries that we're working with, the Philippines. The Philippines accounts for 15 to 20% of the business process outsourcing. So the call center of the world, the agent that you're interacting with through one of your chatbots for customer service, they account for 15 to 20% of the world BPO. And that industry accounts for 9% of the Filipino GDP. So we always talk about BPO is going to be one of the first area that this Gen AI is going to replace, right? So this would affect countries in very different way, in different very form. So we'll leave it at that.
Just with that, okay. Yeah, I'm trying to connect a little bit of the global landscape that I'm seeing, and it's a privilege to have a global role. I sleep less than I should, but I have the privilege of seeing lots of initiatives around the world. So maybe I would like to divide in two components. So the first one is what are governments, what they are trying to do, what's their motivation, and the second, what type of instruments that I think relates to national policies as well. So I think from what I've seen, we have more than 600 initiatives, legal initiatives, introduced around the globe. So it's a lot. one of the key things that I see governments and policymakers trying to solve is what we discussed. Who is responsible? So who should be liable when something goes wrong? Who should be responsible for guarantees? The deployers, the developers, the users sometimes. So there are lots of discussions. The AI Act tried to solve it, and there are other debates discussing that around the globe. So who should be responsible for responsibility, for ethic practices? I think the second component that I see is risk and mitigation. So we discussed a lot about the risk-based approach. That was the approach here. That's the approach that Brazil is trying to bring, Canada, Chile, and other countries. So what types of risks? Should we look into risks in the model phase? Should we look to risks in the application phase? So what type of risks are embedded in those technologies and frontier models as well? What type of risk should we be concerned in the future? There is this third part that's related to transparency, and that's something that we discussed a lot here in the UK, where who should have access to models to test that and guarantee that they are safe enough? What are the risks of providing access to models, and what type of transparency should we provide to deployers, and what type of transparency should deployers promote to users? There is a competition element to that as well. So not only in terms of power, in terms of acquisitions, but also in terms of talent. So the world is just trying to find solutions for that. We also have a huge debate around inputs and outputs. Should we regulate the inputs and the type of uses that companies can do on data? And that relates to privacy issues and copyright issues, but also, or should we be discussing regulation on outputs? So what type of results those the processing of data will result in terms of misinformation or other problems? And that comes to the next point that I see governments trying to regulate elections, so deepfakes and bias and everything related to elections. So you can see all those motivations and all those requirements that are being discussed, and governments trying to do that in different ways. And I think it relates to what Edward brought, that there are some countries that prefer to create national policies. So we see that in Singapore, for example, we see that in Africa, many African countries trying to create national policies. Brazil, they just released last month Brazil's national policies with the intention of creating the first Brazilian supercomputer and etc. So there is a key component on this huge governance ecosystem. That's what type of public policy do we want to enhance in a certain country that respects human rights and cultural issues and try to enhance energy power and compute power as well. So discussing policy making and AI as a crucial part of the national development is important. But there is a second layer that's regulation. So some countries are trying to create co-regulation practices. As the AI Pact in the EU, we have that in the UK, we have that in Canada. So there are co-regulation practices, and also the US with the code there. So there are some attempts to partner with companies and researchers just trying to create this co-regulation mode that can either advance the use of AI but also guarantee safety practices. And I think lastly, we have thousands of bills being introduced around the globe. And what's interesting to see is how the Brussels effect, as we call it. So many countries trying to copy-paste the AI Act and trying to apply their own legal structures. We see that in Brazil, the proposal is a copycat of the AI Act. In Canada, the ADA as well. So what type of problems that could arise when countries are trying to copy the same type of proposals, regulation proposals, without having the same enforcement structure, right? Here in Europe, we have the Commission, we have the Safety Institute. We don't have that in other countries. So I'm really curious to see, and we know that some countries already have binding regulation, as the US, as China. So I'm really curious to see how all those parts, in terms of national policies, governance structures, and binding regulation will be promoted in the world, and how they will respect the global south perspectives of that, and how they will enhance infrastructural issues, but also cultural dimensions of those countries. I think that's it.
I believe that this panel here, it's a good example of how we need different approaches on discussing AI, on safe and responsible AI and the other aspects of it. But there are some challenges of developing a global approach, and we mentioned some of them here already. So they have, for example, a diverse set of values and priorities. If we talk about not the global South, the US, the EU, China, and everything. So just get a little bit, get in Latin America, as we say, just to try to shift the focus a little bit. When we see the regulatory attempts in Latin America, one of the biggest issues that they focus on is the fact that almost every single country in Latin America has been under a military dictatorship over the last 50 years. There is a lot of a discussion of how AI technologies can be used in order to impact the democratic values of the states. So you see that, Ju mentioned over here a lot of the Brazil AI draft law. I've been a part of the helping to draft the law. I've been in some Senate hearings. But even though it looks like a copy-paste of the AI Act because it is not a principle-based approach regulation, it is, as we know, the AI Act is more related to product liability, whereas in Brazil is more a right-based approach. It is like the GDPR. And mostly it is because of the history that we have in the region. Another challenge that we have on this global approach is the regulatory fragmentation. So Juliana mentioned over here, for example, in the US, we have potentially 50 different regulations in one country over there, even though we have the influence of California that just approved a number of bills from neurotechnologies to a specific set of what can be sector-based AI over there. And we also have technological disparities. When you see Africa, so when we see there's a number, it's so interesting anyone has the opportunity to look what Africa is doing. But a lot of the AI initiatives in the region, they are mostly related to ensure sustainable development and inclusion. We talk about supercomputers, we talk about ChatGPT, we talk about neurotechnologies. These people, they still send messages via SMS. They have an entire financial system based over an SMS. So most of the national AI policies, there's how can we guarantee that people in the region, they're not only used to train the models, but they can use the models or the services or anyhow to benefit and not cause harm. We see geopolitical rivalries. We see what's happening between China and the US and try to be at the forefront of regulation and what they are providing. So there's a number of challenges that we can have to have this global approach, but there are also a lot of potential opportunities. We mentioned some of them over here. The work that has been done at the UN level, the work that has been done at the G7 recently, the work that has been done at the OECD, even at UNESCO, and try to get this harmonized, standardized approach. One that I like to mention, I also invite everyone to take a look, is the work of the Council of Europe. So I used to work, I also work at the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe just had the first international treaty on AI, and I don't see a lot of people discussing about it. So we focus on the UAI Act, we focus on what the most rich countries of the world are doing. Wherever we have an international organization that is with more than 50 country members, that is open for a session for any country in the world, where already enshrines a lot of these principles that we need to have for responsible AI.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts about this, and I'll try and condense it into something articulate, but definitely the points that have been raised so far are all super relevant, and totally agree that the work of multilateral organizations is so valuable in bringing different perspectives to the conversation and bringing in the global south. And I actually think the UK has a unique opportunity here to potentially play or build up on its convener role as sort of this third-party, independent-ish nation that can bring in more countries. You know, if, for example, it was to put some kind of summit in an African country, that would be such a great way for bringing people from across the globe to go to a country in the global south and really bring that into the conversation. Looking to the EU, I think it's got a lot of things wrong, but some things right as well. And without kind of acknowledging the EU AI Act, which I have many thoughts on as well. I would say one thing that they have got right is the way that they are consulting on the codes of practice and actually bringing in a lot of perspectives from across the world. I think that's the best way to do it. And also rooting that conversation in technical reality. It's so important that when we do look to operationalize principles, we can actually do it. So looking at transparency or privacy, what can developers do today to try and contribute to those principles being seen in an AI model, for example? So I think that's really important. And I also just want to touch upon AI adoption, which was mentioned, I think, by Edward. In this room today, we probably all have interacted with AI, but we recently did a study and we interviewed people in the US and the UK, and actually only 15% of respondents said that they use AI regularly, which is a really, really small number, and that's also just in the UK. So all of these conversations that we have on AI sort of assume that everyone is using the technology, when in reality, hardly anyone is using it. And I would love to see more of the global conversation look at how we can encourage more people to interact with the technology, because that will also build up trust and gradually over time make people more comfortable. So yeah, sorry, I've lost my train of thought, but that's what I have to say.
Thank you very much again. So I think we've really drilled into the question of what a global approach to responsible AI could be there on the panel, in terms of the number of different frames and sort of lenses you need to take on all of these different points, from sort of infrastructure, adoption, democratic situation in countries, wider sort of differences in legal and regulatory philosophies around the world. So I think it really, highlights the importance of trying to get a very broad global conversation and getting a wide range of stakeholders in the room. But I just wanted to actually just do one follow-up question, perhaps particularly for Juliana and Renato, because you worked in global companies, or you're working in a global company. How did you actually approach the development of your responsible AI principles in Google to try to bridge some of these differences and challenges, given you have a presence in so many different places in the world? How did Google really sort of approach that challenge to think through some of these issues?
Yeah, so we have a central team there, and it's not only, we have different capacities on that central team. So people with different backgrounds, not only developers, but we have philosophers, we have lawyers, so we have different perspectives there. And I think it reflects the type of principles we have. And I think the second layer is that as a global company, we are a really diverse company. And diversity and inclusion is really crucial for everything. I'm a result of that. So I worked 5 years in Google in Brazil, and then I moved, and now I'm part of this global central team based in the UK. My team is super diverse in terms of people with different backgrounds. I usually say that I feel in a cultural soup, that I need to every time try to figure out how to be here as a Brazilian living in the UK and working in such a diverse team. So I think, in a nutshell, it's just keeping multi-stakeholder from the beginning, with different, not only with diversity in terms of people from different regions, but people with different backgrounds and different views on technology. And that's how we do it. We have like really different teams working on not only developing the principles, but also reviewing those principles in the life cycle of responsibility.
I guess all of you know my former boss. Yeah. So there was with all the criticism that you can say about the who manages the entity at X, the person, the organization at X right now, there was a tone from the top when the company decided to be an AI first company. Again, there are potential criticism that can be discussed in different forums over here, but that led when that voice came throughout the company, it gave a lot of room for maneuver and implement governance structures here. So, from implementing a set of guardrails, internal processes, and also try to leverage existing what we already had, and not necessarily reinvent the wheel. So at Twitter and then at X, so we had a really robust global privacy program, there was used to a lot of the instruments that we need to develop and ensure for AI as well. So we talk about a lot of risk assessments we talk about privacy by design, we talk about training, we talk about having a different set of skills, multidisciplinary, from counsels, from engineers, and from people from all of the different parts of the world. That already existed in the privacy program, and that's why when the company decided to be an AI company first, it went through the global privacy team that at the time I had the opportunity to manage. And throughout the implementation of this governance structure, accountability was key. So it doesn't matter that you say you are responsible if you do not demonstrate that you are responsible. So documentation on every single level, testing in every single level, implementing of the different external and internal teams to assess the risks, not only from the teams that were developing the process over there, but that it makes way more, let's say, less easier, or less harder, let's say, to implement this governance structure when you have the leadership of the company also support all of that.
Thanks so much. We're trying to have one more round of questions, and then we'll try and take some questions from the audience as well. So the next thing I want to touch on is the relationship between responsible AI and law and regulation. So you speak to some people, particularly say in civil society, they may say, well, we don't want to hear about responsible AI principles and programs. We want the companies to comply with the law first and foremost, and it should be about effective regulation and enforcement. So obviously there is a very deep relationship between responsibility and complying with the law. So I'd just like to explore that a little bit more with the panel in terms of what they think that relationship is between responsibility and law and regulation, and whether responsibility is something else, it's something additional that works on top of that in terms of a layer relating to ethics. And of course, in a lot of companies as well, we're hearing about ESG governance as well, and where this sort of fits in terms of an overall picture, with obviously law and regulation will always play a crucial role, but where does responsibility fit in that picture? So Edward, can you just give us some reflections on that?
Sure. That's definitely an ongoing conversation, but I think before looking at that, I would be focusing on the infrastructure or the ecosystem. So for example, if we look at research on potential AI safety or AI risk, we have actually did an audit recently. So America, they publish around 4,000-ish paper per year that are related to AI safety per country. Southeast Asia-wise, Singapore is the best one among the region. They have about 400-ish per year. The rest of the Southeast Asia region, excluding Singapore, on average, they have 15 paper per year per country. So what I'm trying to say is there are simply a lot of unknown risks out there that we need to invest much more in to boost up the research ecosystem and also the capacity building among civil servants, among policymakers, among the civil society, before we can talk about what would be the appropriate way to regulate this technology. As Juliana said, simply copying the EU AI Act to another region wouldn't work because the value system behind the legal system is totally different. The priority is totally different. And in the context of EU, you have the EU AI Act, you have the DSA. So they all work together as a complete system. So you can't simply pick one tiny piece and try to copy it to another country. The other thing that I would share is I've mentioned quite a lot of regional challenges, right? There are also some regional initiatives that's trying to address this. So, for example, most of these initiatives right now, especially in Southeast Asia, are voluntary based rather than hard law. For example, the IMDA, imagine that being the Ofcom in Singapore, they have launched two pretty interesting initiatives. One is called Sea Lion, basically a multilingual data set comprised with some of these major languages across Southeast Asian countries to build a model. And then the other thing that is quite interesting is Project Moonshot, which I think is also co-led by IMDA. Maybe Google is also involved, I don't know actually. And that's basically a benchmark that's catering to the specificity of that particular region. Because as I mentioned, as we all discussed, the safety implication will manifest in a different way in different regions. So it's very important to have all these safety benchmarking that are suitable for a particular context before we then talk about hard law, hard regulation. I will leave it at that.
Okay. It's always great speaking after you. So, but I think I would connect to something that we mentioned, because this process is multi-layered and it's multi-stakeholder from scratch. And I love multi-stakeholderism, and we love that in Brazil, right? So something that, as Edward mentioned, we are still learning from the technology. So if we try to regulate without thinking about the possibilities and the opportunity and the infrastructure, we may end up killing that from the beginning, right? But still, we need proper safeguards in place. So I think 3 ideas came into my mind that it needs to be balanced. So our approach to regulation, it needs to be balanced. It needs to get the correct guardrails in place, but also to incentivize infrastructures and opportunities so countries can use that. Like coming from the global south, you mentioned the Asian perspective, some of the countries in Asia, and like the global south is really diverse. So how can we create proper infrastructures so countries like mine, like his, can enjoy the opportunity of AI? So it doesn't increase the disparities that we have between the centers of the world and the global south. So it should be balanced. It should balance the opportunities, it should balance the risks and the safeguards. It should be aligned, and I think we mentioned some of them. And what strikes me the most, and again, all those international bodies, they are trying their best to capture what's happening on AI, but we have really different proposals from the G7 Code of Practice, the UN principles, the OECD principles, the GPA ideas around AI, and now the G20 might release a communique later in November about AI as well. They've been discussing that, and the G20 is going to be interesting to understand that from a global south perspective as well. But we might end up with a patchwork of ideas, of principles, and how do we as companies and as society apply those in practice? So the second point would be, how can we promote aligned frameworks, not only globally, but also locally, respecting the local perspectives in terms of human rights, culture, and infrastructure as well. And it needs to be focused. Renato mentioned the way that Brazil's options with the Brazilian AI Act, no, I'm not calling that, with the Brazilian proposal. So how do you focus your understanding on risks? How you focus your understanding on outputs, and what are you trying ultimately to regulate, right? So the definitions as well, that sometimes they are super broad, and sometimes some of the texts that I've read, they create really impossible to apply requirements. So for example, testing before developing. How can you test something that you didn't develop? So again, there is a lot of excitement around the world with AI, but there is also a lot of fear. And when we are regulating out of fear, we have really challenging ideas and sometimes impossible to comply with ideas. So I think coming to my initial point, where it should be multi-layered and multi-stakeholder, is that, and you mentioned the discussions around the compliance process of the AI Act. That's how we should do that. So we need to see it, companies, researchers, international bodies, and etc., and trying to understand what this means in practice and how we can build regulations that can help countries to seize the opportunity to keep their users and their citizens safe, and then can promote the best of AI. Again, I don't know if you've seen, I think it was last week that 2 members of DeepMind, so 2 colleagues of mine, they won a prize Nobel because of AlphaFold. I don't know if you've seen this application that's called AlphaFold. It's an application that DeepMind developed, and that's helping scientists around the world to understand how proteins sometimes. I'm not going to provide you with a technical perspective on proteins, but from what I understand, like proteins, they have like sequences, and when those sequences, they are sequenced in a strange manner or in a wrong manner, that's what causes diseases. So understanding the shape and format of our proteins that makes our body is really important to develop vaccines, to develop better exams, and to treat diseases better. So this application that DeepMind developed managed to map and to provide with scientists, and it's open, like the shapes of more than 200 million proteins and how they organize and how they disorganize. So it's helping scientists around the world to develop better treatment and better vaccines. So if you see that, for me, after going through a pandemic, you see the potential that it could save lives. So again, I see what's happening worldwide in terms of policy making and listening to the challenges in Asia, and we need to think about the opportunity of AI, saving people, helping people be more creative. I don't know if you use tools, AI tools. It's really, really interesting how we can be, it's a partner for creativity as well. But also comes with risks, and how we are approaching together those two dimensions will define how AI will be in the future for all of us, for my son and for everyone.
Thanks. So I think that the relationship between policy and responsible AI is a very closely interlinked one, as it should be. Policy, regulation, governance, that all informs and achieves specific outcomes. So responsible AI is one of these outcomes that we can use governance mechanisms to achieve, but it shouldn't be the only outcome. It should also be looking at things like AI innovation. And there's one thing in particular I think that we need to bear in mind, and it's if we pursue safe AI so much that it means we don't have AI at all, then I think we're doing something wrong. Obviously, there are risks and we do need to address them, but it shouldn't be so hyper-focused on existential risk, for example, that prevents us from actually engaging with a very transformative technology. And we can already see that with the EU. They do have their AI Act now. And whilst, yes, it's great that they have some kind of legislative framework in place, we're already seeing the impacts of that in real terms because big tech companies are pulling out of the EU. They're delaying AI services. And that's not only having an impact on innovation at the top level, but also for startups and small businesses. Now, if you speak to someone from the Commission, they'll say that the AI Act has innovation measures and it protects SMEs. They've got priority access to things like regulatory sandboxes, which is great. But the thing is, startups and small businesses don't have the resources to build their own models. And if big tech companies are pulling AI services, state-of-the-art models, then startups are ultimately going to have to either build their own, which they can't, or use older models which aren't as performant, which aren't as innovative. So I think moving forward, we really need to try and, when we talk about balance, look at the immediate risks first and be driven by those, like bias and discrimination, which have policy solutions, but then also really try and pivot towards AI opportunity, AI innovation. And I think that France have actually been doing that really well. They have their AI Action Summit that's coming in February. And even that nomenclature, the fact that they've changed it from AI safety to AI action, it doesn't mean that they're not also considering AI safety. It's just one of many things to think about. And I'm also seeing that in the UK as well, which I think is really positive. But we'll see with this new potential AI bill as well.
See, real quick over here, I guess I listed some things that I guess can be taken into account when discussing new regulations. So adaptive regulation, that when we say adaptive regulation, is not only that can adapt to different technologies that evolve, but also can take into account which are the regional approach and the regional issues that take at the national level, at the global south and other ones. So adaptive regulation also means that we should take into account risk-based approach, which means that we should prioritize which are the really big risks, but knowing that the really big risks are not only the catastrophic risks that we say, and can vary from region, to country to country. As I mentioned, to Brazil, if you get the Brazil AI bill, you get issue as related to misinformation. If you get the Chile one, in Africa, there are all different aspects and different risks that need to be taken into account. I guess the bills and regulation that has an incentive, for example, for regulatory sandboxes, where organizations can test their services, their products in a more controlled environment, while being flexible and see what can be stretched for a certain period of time, different types of data that can be used without the without the risk of enforcement at that particular point. When you're talking about enforcement, I guess something that I would always recommend, and I guess regulation can push for that, is to collaborate with regulators and policymakers from the beginning. So from the ideation phase, be there. You see the ICO, you see the DPC, you see the FTC, many other regulations say, hey, we are here not only to apply penalty into enforcements, Steve as a former ICO member over here, but also to help you to develop something that is safer. When you see regulations, it's not only about product liability, but having to take account a rights-based approach. This is really necessary for different parts of the world. And just to finalize over here, to have a lot of instruments for accountability that take into account not only the risk, but the level of development of the organizations and of the countries and the tools that they have at their service.
Final comment is that we discussed a lot about responsibility and safety of AI applications, but it's something that's really interesting is how AI can also keep applications safe. So if you think about content moderation, AI is what helps us to have scalable approaches to content moderation. And all sorts of things, like for sustainability, AI can help the world more sustainable. Scams and spams, AI can help us on that. So I think there is this other dimension of artificial intelligence that it also can help technological applications to be more safe.
Thank you very much. We've got a few minutes left for the next speaker. I can see at least one hand raised there, so we'll take a few questions. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ayesha from Microsoft. So we talk a lot about stakeholders, large corporations, governments, think tanks contributing towards public policy. But I also do think that we miss out on key stakeholders like smaller AI companies that are building their solutions, but also the end users. Mm-hmm. So how do we think about integrating these two groups of stakeholders as we think about the future of AI public policy?
Okay, yeah, great question. So how do we make the stakeholder conversation truly inclusive? And is there anybody we're potentially still missing out on in that conversation? Would anybody like to go first? Or Ayesha, do you want to go?
Yeah, got the microphone. Yeah, you raise a really good point. And I think engaging the public early on and consistently is really, really key. Just going back to the study that we did, of the people that we interviewed, the main feeling was curiosity around AI, but nervousness was very closely followed by it. And I think part of that is just the branding around AI in particular. There's a lot of muddiness around what AI can and can't do. And I would love to see, especially with marketing, just going into the realities and crucially the limitations of AI. I think that's really, really key to getting people enthusiastic about the technology to try it out. In terms of broader stakeholder engagement, just going back to the point that I made about the code of practice and what the EU is doing, I think that is a great way to bring in parties to the conversation because they were accepting so many different responses. I think they had 400 in the end or around that number. And they were not discriminatory in terms of who could actually contribute, and that would have included SMEs and startups as well. So yeah, it's just about being proactive, and I think that we are now starting to see governments do that more and more because they recognize the need to have lots of different diverse inputs.
Just something that we've been seeing a lot and more is you have the service and online consultations, and you got, for example, the European Data Protection Board just closed yesterday. There was the call for consultation for any stakeholder, academics or not, to talk about application of GDPR to generative AI models. So anyone can literally participate. But another thing that is also really useful is to have what they call town hall meetings. That is open to everybody, is not only trade associations, not only that we say, okay, it's going to be the big tech and not the no-names or the ones that have to pay a yearly fee to participate, but really open spaces where anyone can go there, grab the mic and have a voice and discuss the issues that we are discussing over here.
Yes, and that's one of the topics I love the most, and how to include users and citizens on that debate. So I think the same way that we discussed in the past, media literacy a lot, and how people can be empowered to understand what's this informational ecosystem around them, so they can be empowered to make choices and to suggest things. I think AI literacy would be necessary. So we do that a lot at Google. Gemini has lots of tools for AI literacy and for parents as well to understand the relationship between their kids and AI, and for teachers and etc. But I think that's a crucial part of that. The second part is user control. So we need to provide users control of their data usage and understanding of what's happening around them. So therefore, they feel part of that as well. And I think having access to information, so transparency, being transparent, providing guidelines, providing information on what's happening in those systems, but also providing tools for feedback. As a company, I'm saying that we have, for example, Gemini also have a feedback tool, so we can understand when we are getting that wrong, and so we can provide improvements to the system. So I think you mentioned this town hall idea. I've never seen that. So to bring public to broader policy ideas. I remember the IGFs, like the Internet Governance Forums, and all those forums that we've been going for the past 20 years. I think we are that old. So it's been many years. Going to those forums, they are amazing. But still, it's like people that are long time debating tech, digital tech. And I remember in New York a few years ago, the mayor decided to create an initiative where he would bring the population to discuss policy making. Remember, it was called the tent, it was like not only for tech, it was for everything. So he brought the citizens from New York to discuss public policy for New York. So who better than the citizens from a city to define what type of public policy should happen? So I would say like my dream, and I'm saying that as Juliana, not as Google, someone who's been around for a long time on those consultation processes, multi-stakeholder processes. How can we build a real tent to discuss with people that are being affected or that are creating? Gen AI is a creative tool. So the users they also have a play on creating the tool. So how can we extend that discussion to people that are using the tool? So I don't have the solution for that, but I would love to see that happening. And just one last thing, I don't know if you mentioned the European Data Protection Body. They are also about to release a new consultation, I think later in November, about Gen AI and data protection. So for everyone here who wants to engage on that, that's another opportunity to engage on these debates.
Right. SS is great. Capacity building is very important, both on the researcher side, but also in terms of the government official, civil servants, policymaker. So that's what our organization is working on in Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I can hear the other panel's finished, so we're going to have to wrap up here, so we can't take any more questions, but obviously feel free to grab the excellent panelists over lunch and later. So I think just to sum up as well from the panel, I think it's really important to ask questions about what responsible AI means in practice. So if a company says they're doing responsible AI, drill in and actually find out what that really means in terms of the governance and how they're actually implementing it in a by design approach. I think we've heard lots of really interesting references to the importance of regulation by design, essentially about how regulation is going to need to be adaptive to help hold companies to account to achieve responsible AI. And I think also the different views and layers we have to the question, global, regional, national views, the views across the AI supply chain, what does responsible AI mean for developers, deployers, and many other questions. So hopefully we've just scratched the surface, plus all of the really interesting points about multi-stakeholder consultations and things to think about in the future, like citizens' assemblies as well. So thank you very much to the great panel for the conversation.